Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG, and I'm joined by Curtis Daly. Curtis, how are you doing today?
Hi, Helena. I'm a little bit under the weather this week, but we're still going to power on. I'm obviously really excited for tonight's show.
I am absolutely delighted to be joined by you on this incredibly sweltering Friday afternoon/evening, and I look forward to having you on the show tonight. Speaking of which, coming up tonight, Labour is losing ground to the Greens in council by-elections. Iceland, that is the supermarket, not the country, are offering a £1 bounty to any customer who reports a shoplifter. And Zoran Mamdani is still completely rinsing Andrew Cuomo. Stay tuned for all of that and more. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support.
I would fix that within 24 hours. And if I win, before I get into the office, I will have that war settled. 100% sure. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after I win the presidency, I will have the horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled, and we'll do it quickly. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after I win the presidency, I will have the horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled, and it will settle with Ukraine and Russia. I will get them to settle that war very quickly, even before I become president, as a president-elect.
That was Donald Trump on the presidential campaign trail, repeating almost endlessly a promise to stop Russia's war on Ukraine in 24 hours. Well, it's taken a lot longer than that, with 8 months having passed since he entered the White House, and no real signs of the war coming to an end anytime soon. So it's no wonder that before leaving a Russian summit with Vladimir Putin in the Alaskan city of Anchorage, Trump posted this on Truth Social. High stakes! The meeting between the two men will take place at around 8:30 this evening, the first meeting between presidents of the two countries since 2021, when Joe Biden met with Putin in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's that war, of course, that is at the center of this summit on Wednesday. Trump threatened Russia with severe sanctions if a deal isn't reached. That's something he's done before, with an August the 8th deadline to agree a ceasefire or face crippling sanctions completely ignored by Putin. On Air Force One today, the US president was asked if he was serious about economic action.
You had said earlier this week that Putin would face severe consequences if you get the sense from him that he's not interested. What do you mean by that?
Economically severe. Yes, it will be very severe. I'm not doing this for my health, okay? I don't need it. I'd like to focus on our country, but I'm doing this to save a lot of lives. Yeah, very severe.
One idea floated by Trump to end the war is a land swap deal between Ukraine and Russia. And earlier this week, Trump told reporters there would, quote, be some land swapping going on, unquote, in a deal he described as involving, quote, some bad stuff for both countries. On Air Force One, that idea came up again.
Are the territorial swaps on the table? Will you be discussing that?
They'll be discussed, but I've got to let Ukraine make that decision. And I think they'll make a proper decision. But I'm not here to negotiate for Ukraine. I'm here to get them at a table. And I think you have two sides. Look, Vladimir Putin wanted to take all of Ukraine. If I wasn't president, he would right now be taking all of Ukraine. But he's not going to do it.
What the exchange of territory would look like is not yet clear. Russian military currently controls the entire southeastern border oblasts, or provinces of Ukraine, as well as Crimea, which it's occupied since 2014. That's about 20% of all of Ukraine. And if sustainable, the territory currently under Russian control creates a strategically valuable land bridge between Russia and Crimea. One proposal, reportedly presented by Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff to Russia in Moscow, would involve Ukraine ceding the whole of the Donbass, that's the two oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, to Russia in exchange for a ceasefire. The red line on the map marks the current front line, so you can see that would involve Ukraine giving up roughly 1/3 of Donetsk and still under Ukrainian control. In exchange, the suggestion is that Russia would retreat from the Kherson and Zaporizhia, destroying that strategic land bridge. And the big question is, why would they? That any surrender of territory to Russia by Ukraine would be hugely unpopular domestically and politically disastrous for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. If nothing else, that's because of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, many of them conscripts, having died defending them. Zelensky is no part of this summit, though Trump has appeared to concede that there can be no territory agreements without his involvement. Russia, meanwhile, has deployed small signals gesturing that it, rather than the United States, has the upper hand in this meeting. This Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was seen arriving in Alaska wearing a jumper under his jacket that reads CCCP. CCCP is the Russian acronym for the USSR, the bloc that Ukraine was once a part of. Earlier, Russia Today editor-in-chief Margarita Simonyan also wrote that Russia press corps flying to Alaska had been served chicken Kiev as their meal. Putin, meanwhile, is making a slow, meandering journey to Alaska, visiting multiple facilities in the eastern Russian region of Magadan for meetings with the low-level officials and wreath-laying ceremonies. But Trump has been keeping busy and reaching out to a key Putin ally. Before leaving for Alaska, he called Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, reporting this on Truth Social. I had a wonderful talk with the highly respected President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. The purpose of the call was to thank him for the release of 16 prisoners. We are also discussing the release of 1,300 additional prisoners. Our conversation was a very good one. We discussed many topics, including President Putin's visit to Alaska. I look forward to meeting President Lukashenko in the future. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Luckily, this time you don't get me doing an impression of Donald Trump. I do apologize. Last time I tried that. Now, Curtis, what, if anything, do you think that this summit is going to achieve? What do you think each side is aiming to get out of it? And do you ultimately think that territorial swaps are going to be like an inevitability of any kind of peaceful settlement to end the war between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, territorial swaps was kind of, many people for years have said it's inevitable. And actually, many people who are calling for that, or at least saying, is there any sort of part of Ukrainian land that people could give up to stop the killing? They were seen as Kremlin stooges. It's a highly difficult situation and somewhat confusing. I'm a little bit confused with Donald Trump because he swings in roundabouts. I mean, you know, at one point, he's sort of siding with Russia. I mean, let's remember the first sort of bout of tariffs. Russia was sort of left off that list. Many people were saying that he's pro-Russia. There's links there. And now he's saying that he wants to be tough and he can make this deal happen. So let's look at the facts. Well, first of all, Trump said he's going to make this deal happen straight away at the end of war. That's obviously not happened. And obviously it's a ludicrous claim to make because it's very difficult. But the fact is that Trump seems to be positive about the summit. Now, it's important to note that Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, right? He said it'll be a mistake to predict the outcome. Now, I don't know if that's just words or if that's him saying, don't be too positive on a deal here, by the way. Like, we're still going to be in the war for the long haul. So it's very hard to read what's going to come of it. The difficult thing, the really difficult thing here is obviously Ukrainians don't want to give up any of their land. You completely understand that. I mean, imagine if it was us. What part of the UK would we want to give up? It's completely understandable, but you have to put that judgment against the facts that thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands have died, and how many more are going to die in this conflict. And at the end of the day, what we want is peace. But to answer your question of whether the land swap is going to be inevitable, I think it may have been inevitable from the beginning. And that doesn't mean that Ukraine should never have fought back, and doesn't mean we shouldn't support their armed resistance. Absolutely not. You know, you don't give up straight away. But when you have people like maybe Jeremy Corbyn saying maybe to get people sort of round the table straight away, maybe it's important to listen to those voices too, because they have a point to make, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that because you want peace, you're suddenly a pro-Putin apologist. I don't think that's the case. But I don't know what's going to happen. I really, really don't. It's also really hard to judge where Trump stands on this. Now, I think he's absolutely right when he says it's not up for me to say what Ukraine gets. I mean, of course, he's going to say that. It needs to be Ukraine, sort of Zelensky and Ukraine around the table. But how much is going to be given up? I mean, when we saw those graphics of the maps, you know, it could be a lot of land. I honestly don't have a solid answer because I do not know what's going to happen. And I really don't know where to sort of, where to stand with Trump on this. I mean, he seems to be changing his mind all of the time.
Well, I think there's a big case here for the fact that Trump is only changing his mind because he kind of realised he got duped by Vladimir Putin at the start, assuming that Putin was a rational actor in what he viewed as being rational rather than only doing things in Russia's own self-interest. And because he'd been duped, he's become a bit reactionary to Putin. I just want to touch back on your point there about land swaps, though. Obviously, you made a comparison saying, like, what part of the UK would we give up? And again, no one would want to. But a comparison I want to make is no one would accept that to end Israel's siege of Gaza, to end the genocide, they should be willing to give up territory of historic Palestine. I mean, most people don't think that on our side, that they should be giving up any of the entirety of the historic territory of Palestine to the occupiers, right? But of course, some of that has already been ceded by the Oslo Accords, you'd expect. Why would it, you think then, that there is at point any justification in Ukraine giving up any territory, and should it continue fighting to make sure that it maintains all of its territorial integrity? If we would make the same case when it comes to Gaza and the West Bank, as I personally believe, that there should be no ceding of any territory for the Palestinians at all with regards to Israel, even if that would bring about a peaceful solution.
I mean, you make an excellent point, right? And it's absolutely true. I mean, I don't think Ukraine should cede any ground, nor would I want Palestine to cede any land either. But I think when we look at how deals are made, and we look at like sort of in history, it's always messy. It's not always what everyone wants to get 100%. And that pains me to say, because it feels like it's downplaying the wants and needs of those who are affected. I'm just looking at this at a perspective where what happens when a deal is reached? There is sometimes compromise, or a lot of the time compromise made. And at the end of the day, peace is the number one solution. Innocent people dying is what we do not want. But this is why I find it so complicated to talk about, because it's very difficult. Because I agree, and the pushback you give me, I completely agree with that. In terms of, because I was going to make another point about Trump, actually. Maybe he was duped by Putin, potentially. I mean, obviously, Putin was never going to be upfront about his strategies. I mean, obviously, it just shows the political nous of Trump. He has none. But I do wonder, in terms of the wider geopolitics, is Trump, was he worried about a sort of a dislocation between the US and Europe? And actually, maybe he's wanted to sort of be back in favor with Europe, given that this was kind of a wedge issue when it came to Russia and Ukraine. I mean, there were talks of splitting away from the US and creating more of an EU super army, or super defense, because we can no longer rely on the US. I wonder if that plays a factor into this as well.
I mean, in my mind, I think the one thing that Trump really cares about is getting an international peace prize. I think that's all he really wants in terms of his own interests here. I do think that Trump has kind of softened towards Europe. I think you're right, especially given that von der Leyen just completely conceded during their trade negotiations to try and reduce tariffs. Like, Trump's economic belligerence with Europe has paid off, and he's realized that he has captive interests in this region. Obviously, the UK had cucked out months and months ago, but the EU was potentially holding out, given that there was a little bit more steadfastness economically from Canada. But now we've seen the deal go through, which is very favorable to the United States, because they've used their international and geopolitical power and forced Europe to concede. There is more of a reason for Trump to keep them on side now, that he knows that he can essentially get Europe to do whatever he wants by using both the economic and military might of the US and holding it to ransom, essentially, holding the good nature of the US to ransom with the EU and with European countries in exchange for favorable conditions. I think that's what you're going to see. And fundamentally, as long as he thinks America gets what they want out of it economically, and he gets what he wants, i.e. international recognition, that's all that really matters to him. And the lives of Ukrainians, what happens to the territory, is kind of irrelevant to the own personal interest that he holds, which has basically been the driving force behind all Trumpian policy from 2015 until today. That's my opinion on Trump's motivations. At the local elections last year, amongst the chaos of Tory councils being swept away in a tidal wave of support for Reform UK, Labour were also hammered in their former heartland council of Durham, losing 38 council seats and reduced down to a paltry 4, as Reform UK were catapulted into overall control with 65 seats. This was a majority Labour council for almost a century, and this is emblematic of the collapse of Labour's key voting blocs in post-industrial Britain, having failed to overturn neoliberalism that destroyed these communities in the first place. Results like this have led to a popular mainstream press narrative of Labour being uniquely at loggerheads with reform over these areas of the country. Yet, precious few column inches have been dedicated to the threat posed by parties to the left of the Labour Party. In a poll of 811 Labour defectors taken in June of this year, Electoral Calculus found that almost twice as many of them would vote for the Lib Dems or the Greens, rather than Reform UK or the Conservatives. And this is before the launch of a new left-wing party founded by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. The expectation is that more progressive parties would be picking up victories against Labour, areas like London, the kind of progressive areas of the country, and then areas such as the North West and Wales, these would be off limits, right? This was a Labour reform battleground. This, however, is proving not to be the case, as last night saw two council by-elections in Newcastle and Cardiff, areas that have been Labour strongholds since time immemorial. Both seats were taken from Labour by the Green Party. In South Jesmond and Newcastle upon Tyne, the Greens surged by 15% to narrowly pip the Liberal Democrats to win the suburban ward, one known for its high student population. The Labour's vote share cratered by 25%, the majority of which it seems moved leftwards, as the Reform vote share was even less, on just 11% to Labour's 17%. Just for posterity, I will note the Tories only got 3% here, which I think we can all agree is very, very funny. Given the national vote share, this would have been disappointing, but not surprising for Labour, as there has always been a moderately strong Liberal Democrat presence in the area, competing for the centrist voters. The next result, however, should be far more concerning for the Labour Party. In the Grangetown ward in Cardiff, the Labour vote disintegrated by a mammoth 30%, losing to the Green Party. And it's important to note here, the Greens had run a joint campaign last time round in 2022, when these councils were last contested, with Plaid Cymru, but still managed to win despite the Greens and Plaid running separately this time round. Not only is the progressive vote coming for Labour majorities in every corner of the country, the Labour core vote share is now so low that a progressive party can win against them, even when that vote is split. I mean, is it any wonder why? Labour has been very clear it doesn't want our votes. Remember what Keir Starmer said all those years ago?
The door is open and you can leave.
Oh no, they're shaking off the fleas. It turns out, Labour, you needed those fleas to vote for you, didn't you? If you wanted to not lose seats, and not just in London and Manchester, not just in Bristol, but in places like Cardiff and Newcastle upon Tyne as well, right? If you wanted to keep these seats, or indeed the 6-vote margin in Runcorn and Helsby that happened in May of this year, maybe some of those fleas needed to stay on side. Maybe the box that people wanted to put the hard left into, going trot hunting against people who just had basic anti-austerity policies, maybe that might have had a little bit of a negative externality in terms of losing what should be safe Labour areas, heartland seats that have been Labour over a century in some councils here. And that's where they're losing their core voter base, right? And so all of this desire to think that these people have nowhere else to go, which is essentially was the line by the Labour right for such a long time. The left have nowhere else to go, they have to vote for us, is showing to be completely unfounded, and it is costing Labour dearly in places that they should be winning. Like minus 30% is an absolutely kind of meteoric drop in Labour vote share in that Cardiff ward that we're seeing there. And the fact that the Greens can win on such low as 24% is real warning signs for Labour. Now, let's just go back to that electoral calculus poll I mentioned earlier. It shows exactly what I'm saying here about people leaving Labour to its left. Those polled were asked to list reasons why they would not vote for Labour again, having voted Labour in 2024. Whilst all defectors marked Labour down for being out of touch, so true given what Starmer is like, the second most popular opinion by far was that Labour were not Labour enough, an opinion that ranked as the highest amongst Green and Liberal defectors. It's clear that Labour's approach of fiscal caution and anti-migrant rhetoric is putting off many voters to their left. But the question, of course, is that they're trying to win over Reform voters, right? So is it winning over those same Reform voters that they're desperate to keep on side? And true to form, the McSweeney Politburo strategy is paying off just as well as you'd expect. This is the latest poll from Reform-friendly polls to find out now, so please do take it with a pinch of salt. But they have Labour on a quite frankly embarrassing 19%. The lowest Labour have polled since the EU elections of 2019, which were quite an aberration in the long run. Reform are leading with 31%, and the Tories are level with Labour. If replicated at an election, it would give Reform a 100-seat majority and put Labour in third place in seats behind the Liberal Democrats. What was it they kept saying about Jeremy Corbyn? Any other leader would be 20 points ahead. Well, how about any other leader would be on 20 points? The constant focus on migration is basically the same mistake that Rishi Sunak made. to increase the salience of an issue that they kind of know they're going to fail on. They're not going to leave the refugee convention. They're not going to go to a diplomatic war with France, as Maurice Glassman seems to want them to do, over turning the boats back right. They know they're going to fail on the basic thing that the public wants, which is for asylum seekers to just go away and disappear into the ether. And what that's allowed is Reform to capitalise on this endless discussion about migration policy, which tops basically every single political talk show in the country. Although I guess if we stop talking about migration, we'd have to start talking about their disability cuts or their foreign policy, and the public don't like that either. Curtis, this surely makes grim reading for the Labour Party, doesn't it?
Well, thoughts and prayers for James O'Brien when he said that any other leader will be 20 points ahead when Jeremy Corbyn's leader. And you're right, they can't even get 20%. This is utterly embarrassing. I mean, to look at these specific by-election results, in South Glamorgan, which is what the original seat was, I mean, since like 1973, Labour have consistently won over and over again. I think, and then in 1996, it changed to Cardiff, and they consistently won there, bar from 2004 to 2012. That's where the Lib Dems took a minority win in the council. But Labour retook it in 2012, probably due to the coalition. But what we've seen is, I mean, this is kind of central now. Grangetown specifically is a Labour stronghold. They won since, they've been solidly since 2022. But here's the thing, when you look at those results, they've continually lost their support. I mean, in 2022, they had a 12% sort of, they were up on 12% vote share, or 12% more than second place. And it's gone down each year because the Labour vote has been collapsing. It's been a long-term trend since Tony Blair, actually. I think because we're in the era of populism, it's accelerating. But the long-term trends of the Labour Party have been going for a very long time. Now, of course, we had in 2017 under Jeremy Corbyn a sort of spike in support. We all remember that it was a hung parliament and Jeremy Corbyn got 40% of the vote. But having said that, though, a lot of the support was still students, young people, metropolitan areas and cities. But the so-called Labour heartlands were still being lost. So this has been a long-term trend. And sort of the Jeremy Corbyn project was like a big plaster, you know, on some glass where the water was coming out. And now it's been shattered. Now, of course, the grown-ups in the room would say, but in 2024, Keir Starmer got a historic majority. But we're not stupid. It was less votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019. And it's because the Conservatives lost the election. It's very interesting, actually, that you say that they keep talking about immigration. And it's a wild strategy, right? Because probably the number one rule in politics is to try and talk about things that you're best at or what you're known favourably for. So for the Labour Party, you want to talk about the bread and butter issues, okay? People have this vague sort of notion, maybe not anymore under Keir Starmer, but this vague idea that the Labour Party is a bit more fair. They stand up for the ordinary person. They're going to be nicer to poorer people and a bit more progressive on social issues, and the Conservative Party a bit more pro-business. That's the sort of general feeling. So why don't they lean into public services, National Health Service, really strong workers' rights, not sort of dilly-dallying around the edges, instead of doing benefit cuts, instead of obviously, you know, pivoting to the right on immigration. Even when it comes to transgender issues, seemingly reform or Labour are to the right of reform, obviously only in terms of rhetoric, I suspect. And this is the problem with the Labour Party Politburo, as you like to say, is that they seem to believe that if you just reach across the aisle, right, and that's it, that's how you're electorally successful. But it doesn't work. I mean, let's think of 2015. 2015, Labour lost that election. And what was the promise? Ed Miliband said, I'm going to offer austerity light. And the Conservatives were offering austerity full fat, right? And the grown-ups in the room, their analysis was, well, people don't trust Labour on spending, given the sort of financial crisis. Now, I would say, actually, you know, the Labour could have went full populist and said, the 2008 financial crash was happening because of the banks. We stand up for workers and doctors and ordinary people. But they decided to take on the Thatcherite economic sort of paradigm and copy the Conservatives. So people were like, well, we're going to vote for the real thing, which is austerity. And given the fact that David Cameron came across as more competent, then they're not going to vote for the sort of light version. That's the same when it comes to immigration, right? They're not winning anyone over, right? They're going to people and reform voters who hate them, by the way, saying, we're never going to vote for you, but we're going to try and copy your policies. So this sort of pivot to sounding really tough on immigration, even alluding to the Rivers of Blood speech, Enoch Powell quite disgraceful, actually, is not going to convince anyone because people are going to either think, one, I don't trust you. Two, even if I do trust you, why would I vote for you when I know that Nigel Farage and Reform are stronger on immigration? And I think that what this does essentially is reaching across the aisle, but not appealing to your base. Now, of course, compromise is key in an election. You need to appeal to your base and broaden out. It feels like the strategy from the Labour Party will be like Reform saying, we're now really pro-migration because we're trying to reach new voters. Now, of course, that'll be electorally disastrous. I mean, why would Reform do that? They'd sink in the polls, they'd lose their base. But to me, that's kind of the same logic. Whereas actually, the Labour Party should not be doing cutting disability benefits, not keeping the 2-child benefit cap. No, they should be redistributing wealth and power. And as we know, time and time again, is that they're not losing votes to Reform. They're losing votes to the left, to the Liberal Democrats, to the Greens, where the Green Party is kind of like where the Labour Party base is. They want a wealth tax. They want public services in public hands, like renationalisation. They don't want any austerity. And it just feels like, do these people not understand that? Does Morgan McSweeney not understand it? Is he that deluded? Does he not agree with the polls? Or have they almost consigned themselves and think, you know what, we're going to lose the next election. Who cares? Which, by the way, if I was Starmer and I thought I was going to lose the next election, I'd bring in a whole host of radical politics. But of course, you know, Starmer and McSweeney are ideologically opposed to that. So it's I don't think there's going to be any sort of way back for the Labour Party because these deep-seated issues, I think, began with Blair, are not going to be turned around because people have lost trust in Keir Starmer. We've also in today's society, the rules are different. We're in an era of populism. No one trusts the two main parties. So I think what's going to happen is it's going to be a death of the Labour Party. And for me, it can't come soon enough.
I think it's a really interesting point that you brought up there, Curtis, about the continual decline of the Labour Party, especially in those heartland communities, that was continual apart from 1 year. And that year was 2017, right? I think that was broken apart by the second referendum policy and issues maybe on geopolitics, for example, in 2019, right? But the broader anti-austerity message was powerful in kind of keeping hold of a Labour coalition that was steadily disintegrating up until that point. And I think what people don't really realise is that regional inequality is a really big problem. Regional inequality is huge. And whilst I think that there is definitely a difference in voting patterns between rural and urban seats, which in my mind breaks down across age lines, I think there's a lot of a difference in terms of how old you are is more of a contributing factor to how likely you are to vote right or left wing. And this is borne out by polling, it's borne out by election results. People try and make this into a class issue. And actually, I don't think it necessarily is. I definitely think that the middle class people are more likely to vote kind of Labour or Lib Dem. But the people who are poorer are shown to vote for both Green and for Reform, if you look at the actual results here. And when you look at, for example, the results in 2019 and 2017, Labour still won a plurality amongst working age people. It's the older people in the older constituencies. Like if you look at somewhere in the northeast, you look at somewhere in Cardiff, the inner city seats, they're not exactly rich in terms of the people who live. They don't earn a lot of money in lots of cases, especially in places like Newcastle, left behind areas of the country that have seen the worst of deindustrialization, of the lack of investment coming from the state, which hasn't been overturned, by the way, in anywhere near the amount that it needs to by the Labour government. What was their first thing they were doing was more investment into Oxford and Cambridge, like they need any more of it. And so you've seen these areas of the country continue to be more deprived. But it is the age demographic of the rural seats, which are much older, and the younger seats with high student populations. People have migrated there for service sector jobs because those things don't really exist in more kind of spread out rural constituencies. If you want to get a job as a young person, you basically have to move to an inner city today because of the lack of industrial work outside of the cities, because it's a service sector economy. And that's led to this kind of disparate voting intention, which is broken down by age. But regionally, you still see moves against Labour, and this is happening across the country. It'll be interesting to see if the current polls stay as they are, or if indeed if a new left-wing party from Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn, or led by whoever it might be in 4 years' time, or indeed at the local elections next year, if those warning signs, which clearly aren't being heeded by the Labour Party about where they're hemorrhaging votes to progressive voters to their left, will leave them decimated in areas of the country that they thought were former strongholds, because it's a lot of Labour defences next year. We kind of missed how badly Labour are doing in local elections in May because it was mostly Tory defences, right? The big story was Tory losing votes to Reform are the new kids on the block, let's talk about them. And that's been the story ever since the meteoric rise of Reform. But I think people are going to miss just how devastated Labour are going to be in inner city and metropolitan areas, as you rightly point out, Curtis, come the local election results next year. And maybe we might see a little bit more of a platform for people to the left of Labour rather than this continual concentration on Labour versus Reform, which, to be fair, I don't think it's unreasonable. I think it's worth pointing out that Reform win a lot of their votes from people who didn't vote last time round. Low propensity voters who feel completely disabused by Westminster, who are getting back into voting because of Reform. And that's who Labour are trying to fight for the votes for. Again, I just don't think there is any way that you're going to win them over as an establishment party who, in their minds, already have a history of failing on migration policy, because Blair was the party of mass immigration as far as they're concerned, even though it was kind of higher under, for example, Boris Johnson in 2022. So there's a lot of things going on here, a lot of things at play, but the local elections next year are going to be really, really interesting. Definitely worth sticking around to check out those. Shoplifting is becoming an increasingly visible crime in our cities and in our towns. Whether it's the major supermarkets or local shops, pharmacies or the nation's beloved Greggs, every kind of retailer has felt the impact of a more brazen approach to stealing. And it's not just an impression exaggerated by online bots and right-wing culture warriors. The stats back it up too. The year to March 2025 saw the highest level of shoplifting recorded by police in England and Wales since 2003, with over 500,000 offences recorded. That's up 20% on 2024, itself a record-breaking year at the time. The problem is real, but the solution, as well as the causes, are unclear. Supermarket giant Iceland has announced that it will pay customers £1 each time they report a shoplifter in its stores, after it was revealed that the chain is losing around £20 million annually from the shoplifting crime. Government ministers have also been encouraging the public to report cases. This was Policing Minister Diana Johnson on BBC Breakfast earlier this week.
Clearly, I want people who see shoplifting to report it. In fact, I was in Hull recently in my constituency, and I was in Marks and Spencer's, and a man just came in and took a really large bunch of flowers from the flower display at the front of the shop. And I was so shocked he'd done that. I went to tell the assistant what had happened. So that kind of brazen boldness of shop theft has to stop. And shops have a role to play in that, in terms of increasing their security and making sure that items are not easily available in the way that perhaps they were in that store.
So you weren't thinking of a citizen's arrest, even though you're a policing minister?
To be honest with you, I was so shocked at the brazen nature of him just coming in and picking the largest bunch of flowers and walking out of the store. Immediately, I went to the shop assistant to tell them what had happened. But it is unacceptable, and that's why we're clamping down in the crime and policing bill, getting rid of what the previous government introduced, which was this idea that if you stole less than £200, nothing would happen to you. You wouldn't actually face, the consequences of your crime.
Now, what Johnson says there isn't quite true. The so-called £200 rule is from the 2014 Anti-Social Behaviour Crime and Policing Act, a Tory Lib Dem coalition law, and it doesn't say the police shouldn't investigate what it calls low-value shoplifting. Rather, it says that that kind of shoplifting should be dealt with summarily, which means by a magistrate's court which can only impose prison sentences of up to 6 months and fines. Multiple retail chains, however, have suggested that the law has caused police to deprioritise shoplifting as a crime. And on several occasions, police have admitted that themselves, like here in 2023, and also here in 2017. The problem is wider than just retail businesses feeling a hit to their bottom line, though. Frontline staff are increasingly feeling the threat of violence when trying to intervene. According to the British Retail Consortium, 2,000 retail workers suffer incidents of physical violence or abuse every single day. Despite that risk, one Tory police boss thinks that it's the public's job to tackle these crimes. This was Matthew Barber, Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley, speaking earlier this week.
If you've got someone in your store now stealing from you, call 999. Also, ideally, try and stop them leaving. Don't just stand there and watch, which a lot of people do, which frustrates me. They push through the barrier at Tube Station, the staff are doing nothing. I agree, they're not, that's terrible, but you're the idiot standing there with a mobile phone. You're not doing anything either, are you?
Barbara also said this: if you're not even going to challenge people, you're not going to try and stop them, then people will get away with it. That's not just about policing, that's a bigger problem with society. People who don't do anything. You're part of the problem. So what's fueling the rise, not only in shoplifting, but also it's increasingly done out in the open. This is from The Week magazine earlier this year. The Association of Convenience Stores, which represents over 50,000 shops, says that almost half of shoplifters are repeat offenders, known as local prolifics, with drug or alcohol problems. One such offender interviewed by the BBC in 2023 was estimated to have stolen goods worth over £140,000 in 1 year. A 2018 report by the Centre for Social Justice found that drug dependency drives about 70% of all UK retail theft. Recent years have also seen an increase in organised gangs that target shops, stealing goods that are then sold on at discount prices. The rise in the cost of living, which has raised economic pressures generally and made everyday items more expensive, has almost certainly also increased such crimes. Self-checkouts in large supermarkets haven't helped either. One poll in February suggested that 37% of British adults had deliberately failed to scan an item when using self-service checkouts. These people, which have been dubbed swipers, seemingly well-intentioned patrons engaging in regular shoplifting. And retailers say that failure to police shoplifting properly has made the problem much worse. So, with all that in mind, Curtis, are you up for being a supermarket vigilante?
Unsurprisingly, my answer is no. And I was reading into it, and some were saying you can offer £1 from some supermarkets were doing it as well. There's apparently a policy that's being discussed, which, I mean, there's so many things to sort of come at this. The first thing is to obviously address austerity and public expenditure cuts, right? And it's kind of strange that if you even got supermarkets, right, saying, you should intervene and encourage people to do so, we've kind of outsourced policing to the market. It's very neoliberalism. I think what Commissioner Barber was saying was by the way, absolutely disgusting. It's look, for a lot of people, it's scary, right? People not get involved because they don't care. People are worried. Maybe that person does have a knife on them. Who knows? But what's really frustrating is he's calling people idiots on the phone who are apparently part of the problem when you've just read out in your segment that drug-fueled shoplifting is a major problem. Maybe the police should stop the war on drugs. Maybe we should look at drugs like adults and start addressing it as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. Maybe we could get somewhere. At the end of the day, all roads to me lead to neoliberalism and Thatcherism, right? Over the last 45 years, we have seen a decimation of the public realm. And it's not just materially, by the way. I do think there's maybe a cohort of people who are doing sort of gang-related shoplifting, almost organised shoplifting, where maybe not every single person is completely destitute, and they might not need to do it in terms of sort of getting food on the table. But I would still blame neoliberalism because I think that the public realm being decimated means that people are feeling alienated. And I think this toxic, poisonous ideology of individualism has really created that. We're creating a society where people don't trust other people anymore. And that is obviously, as a Marxist, I blame a lot of that on material conditions. But I do think there is a sense of, not belonging anymore. There seems to be disunity within the communities and communities wider across the nation. I mean, if you have politicians and the media, the political parties saying, we do not have a society, right? All we need to care about is yourself and your friends and family, but the rest of society doesn't matter. Then what to expect? Now, compound that with austerity. Then of course you're going to get this. You're going to see a rise in crime. And of course, crime is largely down to poverty and obviously drug-related instances or people being dependent on drugs. Again, it's a health issue, not a criminal issue. But when you absolutely decimate the public realm, this is what's going to happen. Maybe also in terms of the social democratic argument, if we just stop cutting our public services in terms of policing numbers, maybe they can deal with the issue. But instead, the police would rather spend the weekend locking up 500 people for holding placards for standing against the genocide, because they're the real criminals. Now, obviously, that's a really good of resources. But ultimately, and fundamentally, it is down to inequality and poverty. I mean, just to be anecdotal here for a second, when you go to the supermarket, look at how many things are behind security tags now. Like cheese. In my local Aldi, there's literal tags around cheese. There's meats, baby formula. And you need to look at that and really reflect on where we are in society, right? A lot of crime and a lot of shoplifting is obviously down to the fact that the state and the economy doesn't adequately provide for your average person. And politicians and the police are not interested in that, not really. because you have to fundamentally change society. You have to fundamentally change the economy. And that might mean upsetting, I don't know, some of your corporate owners, because maybe you want to add a wealth tax so we can create a more equal society and redistribute wealth and power. These are big decisions that the politicians don't want to do. And the result is far more reactionary policies. I mean, you've seen Reform and Nigel Farage in the last couple of weeks saying, we are a lawless country. Now, he's now got his next talking point. He's going to come down hard on crime, which I get confused by Reform. Either we're lawless or you get locked up for a tweet. So I'm not quite sure which one they're going to go with, but they throw a lot of shit and it sticks somewhere. So they're happy to say we need to put more money in policing, even if they're not even really doing it. But they want to sound tough on crime. And not to sound like Tony Blair here, but he did say tough on the causes of crime too. We've kind of forgot even that first bit, which is looking at the results from it. But ultimately, if you look at the wider society, you have to change it radically. And it's not a short answer. And unfortunately, one of our sort of ills of our political system is we vote in a general election every 5 years and people sort of expect instant results. But if you've had 45 years of neoliberal economics and individualism, you can't fix that in 5 years. Now, this is not me defending Labour, by the way, because I think they've been awful within the year they've done already. They don't have the ideas, or they don't even want to change society radically. But obviously, media pundits do want sort of a quick answer, when really we need to be looking at 10, 15, 20 years of structural change, of dealing with inequality, of dealing with poverty, of rebuilding the public realm so people feel as if they're part of a community and society. And we need to deal with the drug problem, which is not to wage war on drugs, but treat it as a health issue. When we start investing in people and have a more compassionate society, you're going to see less and less of these acts happening. But no one seems to be interested.
I think you're absolutely 100% correct. I could not have said it better myself, right? What's that? Like, the base informs the superstructure. Wow, if only someone had thought of such a thing many centuries ago at this point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you have a society where we fundamentally think that everyone should be acting in their own rational self-interest, right? Well, of course, people are not going to care about anybody else. That's the selfishness, the greed that was taught to be good as a kind of tenet of Thatcherism, right? And fundamentally, a lot of people who engage in kind of petty crime have no stake in society. And that's the problem. But the whole point of the state is to make sure people have that stake in society. The Thatcher argument, you should get rid of the state, give people property, and they'll have a property-owning democracy, and that will give them the stake in society. But of course, that never worked because all of that got subsumed by the capitalist class. The rich people had much more leverage within the market, were able to subsume all of the kind of the property-owning democracy of the people who own the council houses. Then they got sold to landlords. If you look at things like the stocks that were sold from the privatized industries, like the Don't Tell Sid stuff, that was all subsumed by people like private equity buying out people's stakes so they could afford to survive. And it's led to people who have no ownership of their own lives, no ownership of their own stuff, and no ownership of their own workplace. If you want to give people more of a stake in society and feel like the society is going to be there for them and vice versa, there has to be a new social contract. And for there to be a social contract in the first place, we have to ditch the ideology, as you rightly point out, that says that such a social contract cannot exist, which is why it's so ironic that people like Robert Jenrick, who does all these videos about the social contract and petty crime, have been part of the foundational ideology that caused that to happen in the first place. Talk about egg on your face. Disgraced former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, has been reeling since he was convincingly defeated by NYC State Assembly member and Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani in the Democratic NYC mayoral primary. Having lost the primary, Cuomo is running again in the full mayoral election as an independent, alongside current Mayor Eric Adams, also independent, and Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa. NYC is in the midst of an affordability crisis, just like many other places in the world, and it is Mamdani's relentless focus on the cost of living that earned him the win in June. One of his key policies to address the cost of living crisis was his plan to freeze the rent for all rent-stabilized units in NYC, something that was done 3 times by former NYC Mayor Bill de Blasio, so it's not exactly a radical policy. Cuomo, however, who was backed by the landlord lobby during the primary, thinks he has found something scandalous to attack Mamdani with, however.
I also want to comment on the recent scandal about Assemblyman Mamdani. He lives in a rent-stabilized apartment. Rent-stabilized apartments are one of the main ways we provide affordable housing in New York. about 40% of the units are actually rent stabilized. And these units are meant for people who have trouble paying rent, who can't afford rent, because affordability is a major topic. And Assemblyman Mamdani is a man who can obviously afford rent. He's a man of means, but he's living in a rent-stabilized apartment.
So this kind of gesturing toward like imagined hypocrisy. Oh, you're a socialist and you live in rent-stabilized apartments. That could be somebody else's apartment. Is so facile to me because on one hand they'll accuse people like I know Hassan Pike. Oh, you live in an expensive mansion. How dare you as a socialist? And then the other hand, it's Zohran Mamdani living in the one-bedroom apartment in Astoria. And then it's like, oh no, you can't do that either. You have to live in exactly the apartment that I tell you to live in. Your housing situation has to be what I will ascribe to you as a socialist for it to be justified. And in the end, like, it reminds me of the conversation we have in this country about people who live in council housing. Now, of course, we don't have enough council housing, just like New York City doesn't have enough rent-stabilized apartments, even at 40% of the units within New York City. But when you hear, like, was it Oksana Bagan, I believe it was, correct me if I'm wrong, who was in a council house, she got pilloried for that. Mick Lynch, I believe, was also pilloried for that kind of stuff. I'm like, well, no. As socialists, we believe that affordable housing should be for everybody. We believe in maximising the stock of both either rent-stabilised or, for example, council housing in the UK for everybody. I mean, it used to be the case in the UK that we had council housing that most people could get access to. And this idea that somehow that as someone who earns I think it's $200,000 or something like that in total should be confined to only renting in non-stabilised private accommodation, it makes no sense to me. Speaking of which, Cuomo then inexplicably went on to accuse Mamdani personally of making people homeless. Well, over on Twitter, he said this. Somewhere last night in New York City, a single mother and her children slept at a homeless shelter because you, Assemblyman Mamdani, are occupying her rent-controlled apartment. You grew up rich and married an even wealthier woman. You've had weddings on 3 continents. You own property in LGBTQIA plus murderous Uganda. You make $142,000 a year plus stipends, and your wife works too, meaning you together make well over $200,000 most likely. No matter which way you cut it, Zohran Mamdani is a rich person. You are actually very rich, yet you and your wife pay $2,300 a month, as you have bragged for a nice apartment in Astoria. That should be housing for someone who needs it. We're in the middle of a historic affordability crisis. Millions of low-income New Yorkers need this apartment and an apartment like it. And your apartment remains rented to rich people who don't need it. Cuomo, who himself pays almost quadruple what Mamdani pays for housing, has come up with a solution for what he sees as people hogging rent-stabilized units.
I think rent-stabilized units, when they're vacant, should only be rented to people who need affordable housing, not people like Zohran Mamdani. And I'm going to call it Zohran's Law because it's an abuse of the system and it's a fraud. And New Yorkers have a sixth sense where they can detect a person who's a fraud. And that's what's going on here.
I'm enjoying that he still can't pronounce Mamdani's name correctly. I'm like, you've been on the campaign trail for months now, Andrew. You should learn how to pronounce the name of the person that you're going up against. A couple of things to comment on here. The first, when it comes to that tweet, I'm like, no, people are homeless in New York City because landlords are awful and keep jacking up rents. And there's not been enough affordable housing being built, and rent stabilization doesn't go far enough in New York City. We'll come to more on the reasons for why there's a homelessness problem in NYC, right? One person in Zohran Mamdani's case, whether they live in a rent-stabilized apartment or not, is not making any difference to the problem of homelessness in New York City. So trying to accuse him of personally making people homeless just because he happens to live in an affordable apartment is, quite frankly, nonsensical. And when it comes to the Uganda stuff, like he's a US citizen. The reason why he's in America is because he prefers it, right? Him being a LGBTQIA plus ally, which Zohran is completely disconnected to the fact that he was born in a different country, which is, if I might say, a bit racist maybe, a little bit racist. Well, you've got connection to another country and they're not nice to gay people. That means that you're a hypocrite. Do you think he chose to be born in Uganda? Real nonsense. And when it comes to imposing like a law in terms of where people go, well, people's circumstances can change. People may, at one point, not need rent-stabilized housing in New York City, and you say, well, you have to go into somewhere that isn't rent stabilized, right? You can afford somewhere more than that. Well, what if their circumstances change? Well, if they lose a lot of money, you're going to be able to find them somewhere affordable to live. Well, if all the rent stabilized housing has already been taken up because you've decided to allocate it in whatever means test you see fit, they'll have nowhere else to go. Again, the solution here is more affordable housing, which is Mamdani's plan for public housing, which is what sorely lacks in the United States. Not ever more means testing, as if anyone in the Western world wants there to be any more of that. Now, if like us, you've been following this race closely, you'll know that a central plank of Zohran's attacks against Cuomo have been his history of being scandal-ridden. Here he is detailing a litany of Cuomo's misdeeds during the primary debate.
To Mr. Cuomo, I have never had to resign in disgrace. I have never cut Medicaid. I have never stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from the MTA. I have never hounded the 13 women who credibly accused me of sexual harassment. I have never sued for their gynecological records, and I have never done those things because I am not you, Mr. Cuomo. And furthermore, the name is Mamdani, M-A-M-D-A-N-I. You should learn how to say it because we got to get it right.
But now that Cuomo has unearthed the career-ending scandal that Mamdani, shock horror, lives in an apartment, he's been forced to up the ante, producing this scathing attack on Cuomo on Tuesday.
4 years ago, Andrew Cuomo resigned in disgrace, and you probably know why.
The governor's office kept the nursing home death data secret.
Cuomo aggressively groped an aide.
Inappropriately touched a female state trooper.
Use of state resources for a COVID-19 memoir.
Less well known is what he spent the last 4 years doing, besides getting trounced in the Democratic primary. In 2022, Cuomo started Innovation Strategies LLC to represent individuals and corporations in a variety of matters. Definitely not vague. Last year, it raked in more than $500,000. Who paid for Cuomo's services? He refuses to say. But what journalists have been able to piece together is troubling. In April, Bloomberg revealed that Cuomo advised a cryptocurrency exchange based in the Seychelles as it faced federal investigations. Then in May, Politico reported that Cuomo failed to disclose $2.6 million in stock options to the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board. His excuse? The stocks were technically owned by Innovation Strategies LLC, of which he's the sole proprietor. Finally, in June, the New York Times uncovered that Cuomo had worked with his longtime friend Andrew Farkas on a luxury marina project in Puerto Rico. Farkas' previous partner on luxury marinas in the Caribbean? Jeffrey Epstein.
We had a finance chair like none other, Andrew Farkas.
That's the thing about Andrew Cuomo. Once you think you found out about all of his scandals, you find out about another, and then another, and then probably another. But if my friend, the disgraced former governor of the state of New York, feels that's unfair, Habibi, release your client list.
That's right. Let me get this straight. On one hand, we have a guy who contributed to thousands of COVID care home deaths, who has multiple accusations of sexual harassment, who took away public transportation funds, who has professional connections with associates of Jeffrey Epstein, who has links to dodgy crypto exchanges, and who failed to declare assets of public interest, versus a guy who scandalously rents out an apartment on what is kind of a middle-class salary in New York City. It seems mad, really, that Cuomo would want to make this race about character, although I guess he didn't have much choice when everyone also hates his policies. And if that wasn't enough, Cuomo's feigned concern for the homeless is entirely performative. During his tenure as New York governor, the rent-stabilized stock of NYC went down 96,000 units. And on top of this, Cuomo cut state funding for Mike Bloomberg's homelessness voucher program, leading to a 35% spike in homelessness. Right. Imagine being more austere and more right-wing than Michael Bloomberg. The proof, however, will be in the pudding when it comes down to the actual election, and the polls make good reading if you're a Zohran fan. Mamdani is 19 points ahead in the current polling, against a field split between the other right-wing candidates, although other two-candidate preferred polls shows that Mamdani also beat each candidate individually. So even in the unlikely scenario where two of the other three candidates dropped out, Mamdani will still emerge victorious on current polling. Polls also show that Mamdani is beating Cuomo and Adams with conservative voters, showing that, in fact, voters do respond positively to populist rhetoric and economics, and the desire by centrist Dems to appear moderate to win these voters is the mug's game to win these people over. In an uncertain world where everyone, regardless of political affiliation, is sick of establishment candidates, political dynasties, what voters really want to see is sincerity and clarity, and Zohran's outreach to NYC Trump voters has clearly paid dividends. Curtis, Zohran's opponents are just getting so desperate now, aren't they?
Oh, so desperate, so desperate. I have to say, the response from Mandani, oh, chef's kiss. Release the Cuomo list is fantastic. First of all, yeah, absolutely hilarious that he's trying to say that Mandani is increasing homelessness because he's a wealthy person using subsidized housing. As you pointed out there, when Cuomo was mayor, homelessness went up. So under his watch, it happened. Then, of course, all the other scandals that come with that. What's really interesting, though, is it's sort of a personal... It's not a systemic attack against Mandani, of course. When you say, well, this guy's a rich person and he's living in a $2,300 apartment, to me is kind of akin to when we say, I think we should accept refugees, and then someone turns around and says, well, why don't you house them in your apartment? And once you break that logic, it makes no sense because, of course, in terms of refugees, it's a global issue. It's not going to change anything if I were to keep them in my household. So if Mandani was to leave that apartment, what does suddenly rent is really, really cheap? Homelessness ends? No, it's crap. At the end of the day, policy is what matters. Homelessness goes up under Cuomo, and Mandani wants to freeze the rent. So there's that. I'm kind of surprised that Cuomo's... Okay, maybe not surprised, right? Because, of course, he's getting desperate. And this is what happens when you don't have a policy platform or a positive campaign. You do have to attack. But given that Mandani doesn't sort of step down, and he will come back and he will talk about the sexual assault allegations, he's got some brass neck about him. And I think the response of Mandani is absolutely what the left need to be. We need to be aggressive. We need to take no shit, right? None of this liberal sort of, when they go low, we go higher. Absolutely not, right? People actually... respect strength. I mean, if you think about Donald Trump, actually, I think he's an incredibly weak man, by the way. I mean, he sues everyone that disagrees with him. He's an incredibly weak and egotistical person, but people think he's strong. And I think people respect that. So I do want to see more leftists not shy away from attacks, but lean into it because it was absolutely incredible. It's also funny that it was the perfect liberal response from Andrew Cuomo as well by saying, I think that rent controls or stabilized rent should only be for poorer people. That's classic means-tested policy. Rent controls and freeze the rent, I would support that for everyone. I don't care if you have a lot of money or not. It's important when you have universal and universalism because that means everyone has a stake in society. Let's look at the National Health Service. Why does the NHS exist today, even though it's being carved up and underfunded and privatized? Why does it so exist? It's because it's not means tested. If we had free healthcare for just lower income people or those on welfare, there would be no NHS. But because anyone can use it, you then have the consensus of the British people and those that live here to keep it. So it's a classic liberal response by saying we need to make sure we just subsidize it for poorer people, which, by the way, he's not even interested in doing it. And so what if Mandani is doing all right for himself? It's the classic sort of, like you said earlier, like socialist means when you're poor. I mean, socialism isn't a poverty cult. And when you brought up Hassan Piker as well, he's obviously a very wealthy person. It seems to me that critics will attack you when you're rich, will attack you when you're poor. When you talk about the rich and powerful, when you talk about inequality, it's because they don't want you talking about these issues. But I have to say, no notes from me, especially with a bit of Habibi. It was hilarious. And honestly, Mandani has so much charisma. It is beautiful. And obviously that poll as well, what you showed, where he's actually more popular with conservative voters. Now, that doesn't surprise me because on your show a couple of weeks ago, there was a poll that showed, a series of polls that showed that Reform voters preferred Jeremy Corbyn to Keir Starmer. Bernie Sanders, right, is far more popular with Republicans than your milquetoast liberal like Kamala Harris. Why is that? It's because the left, not liberals, the left actually have principles, policies, and I think people respect that as well. People might say, I disagree with you on that, right? I really don't like your policies on that. But this is what you say, this is what you mean. Someone like Keir Starmer, no one can trust him, he's a flip-flopper. The Democratic establishment, those kind of people, they don't have a backbone, they don't have principles, or at least Mandani, you know what he stands for. And people respect that. And I just cannot wait when Mandani beats him for the second time.
It's going to be Incredibly sweet, isn't it, Curtis? I think you're right. The Starmer comparison is just so on point. Because actually, we did the poll that we brought up from Labour defectors earlier on in the show today. It did show that two of the reasons people didn't like him, and these were across the board, by the way, it wasn't just progressives who had this opinion, it was also Reform voters too, which is to your point here, is that Starmer as a prime minister is uniquely disliked amongst both of them. And on top of this, they both saw him as weak as well. Again, he has no vision. He has no plan. He doesn't actually tell voters what he's going to do sincerely. He doesn't articulate a direction for the country. He just tries to essentially triangulate a position. And in trying to please everybody, he pleases nobody. And this is exactly the same mistake that the Democrats will make if they don't take on the kind of platform that's been advocated by the Mamdanis and the Bernie Sanders of this world that has a broader popular appeal on the populist axis, which can unite people who are independents, Democrats, and indeed some Republicans as well, as we've seen from the internal polling, where Mamdani is much more favoured than the establishment figures, Cuomo and Eric Adams amongst conservatives. Thank you very much, Curtis, for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much. It's been an excellent show. And of course, I love co-hosting with you, Helena.
It is always a pleasure to have you joining me, Curtis. So thank you very much for that. And thanks everyone at home for tuning in. Back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.